The desert sun had begun its slow descent beyond the rugged mesas of Arizona territory when Thomas Reddington, a former Civil War medic turned frontier wanderer, urged his tired mule along the dusty trail that cut through the Salt River Canyon, unaware that the decision he would make before nightfall would ripple across the lives of hundreds and write his name into the whispered stories of two nations. He carried only a leather satchel, a tin canteen, a journal filled with sketches of the land, and a stubborn belief that kindness, though rare on the frontier, was still worth offering, even when it cost a man dearly. The air shimmered with heat. Cacti stood like silent sentinels guarding secrets older than memory, and the wind carried the faint scent of yucca and dry soil. Thomas had spent months drifting between outposts and settlements, tending wounds, helping travelers, and learning from the Apache when they allowed him near. And though he spoke a little of their tongue, he remained cautious, knowing the line between friend and foe could turn sharp as obsidian. As the sky faded to an amber glow, he noticed movement near a patch of mesquite brush to figures stumbling, swaying, barely managing to stay upright, and instinctively, Thomas's hand went to the small knife at his belt. Before he realized the two shapes were young Apache warriors, scarcely more than boys, their hair tangled with dust, their chests heaving, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and hunger, and he could see from their staggered gait that whatever ordeal they had endured had drained them to the edge of collapse. They carried no weapons, their moccasins were torn, and their breaths came in ragged gasps as if they had been running for days. Thomas hesitated, his pulse tightening, because offering aid to Apache youth could be seen as an act of alliance or betrayal, depending on who was watching, and yet his medic's instinct overrode every trembling warning in his mind. He stepped forward slowly, palms open, speaking softly in their language. "Shia, do you need water?" The younger of the two, a narrow-eyed boy with soot smeared along his cheek, nodded weakly before collapsing to his knees, while the older one tried to speak but could only cough, his voice raw as desert stones grinding together. Thomas helped them to the shade, gave them careful sips of water, and studied their injuries: bruised ribs, blistered feet, swollen joints, cuts that had dried without proper cleaning. And when he asked, in fragmented Apache, what had happened, the older boy whispered one trembling word: Dienda, enemy. They had been chased, hunted, separated from their group, and Thomas felt a knot tighten in his gut as he realized these boys were not simply exhausted. They were fugitives, survivors of some violent encounter, and by helping them he might be inserting himself into a conflict that could swallow him whole. Still, as lightning flickered on the horizon and the desert shifted into the violet hues of early night, he guided the boys to his small camp, a patch of flat ground beneath. A rocky overhang helped them lie down, and tore pieces from his own shirt to bind their wounds. The younger one, now half asleep, murmured something about their father and the warriors searching, but Thomas assumed it meant they feared being found by whoever had attacked them earlier. He cooked a small pot of beans over a crackling fire, fed the boys slowly, and when he saw their eyelids droop with bone-deep fatigue, he made a decision that would become the spark from which legends grow. He gave them his bedroll, the only warm bedding he had, and insisted they rest while he sat against the canyon wall, keeping watch. As they slept, their faces softened, no longer the hardened expressions of young fighters, but simply children whose burdens were too heavy for their years. And Thomas felt a protective instinct swell within him. He did not know their names, their clan, or their story, but he knew they had trusted him with their lives. The night deepened, stars scattered across the sky like chips of broken ice, and Thomas traced constellations with sleepy eyes, unaware that far beyond the canyon ridge, silent shadows were already descending the slopes. Warriors, moving with the precision of wolves, tracking the scent of kin, answering a call older than the rivers. Near midnight, the wind changed, carrying with it a distant, rhythmic tremor, hoofbeats, dozens of them, maybe more, and Thomas stiffened, rising slowly, scanning the darkness with a medic's calm and a soldier's memory of danger. The fire dimmed, crackling like nervous whispers, and the older Apache boy stirred in the bedroll, muttering in fear, "They are coming. Father is coming." At first Thomas thought it meant rescue, but then the boy's eyes widened in terror, not relief, and he understood with a sudden chill. The father was not coming alone. A deep echo rolled across the canyon like approaching thunder war cries. Drums, hooves, the unmistakable thunder of a large war party, and Thomas's blood froze as he realized he had unknowingly sheltered to sons of a powerful Apache chief whose full war band was now riding toward his exact location. And the tales he had heard in frontier saloons came rushing backstories of a fierce leader known for hunting down any danger to his children with relentless fury, a chief whose warriors numbered in the hundreds. Thomas stepped back, gripping the rock wall for balance, watching silhouettes appear along the ridge, at first a handful, then a wave, then a sea of shadows illuminated by moonlight. At least 150 warriors descending like a living storm, their horses snorting, their spears glinting, their eyes fixed on the small glow of Thomas's campfire. His heart pounded, breath shallow, as he realized he stood alone, unarmed, beside the sleeping Apache youths whose desperate escape had triggered the full wrath of their people. He could flee into the night, try to vanish into the canyon, but the boys, weak, injured, helpless, would be found in his bedroll, and the warriors would see only one thing: an outsider with their chief's sons lying vulnerable under his care. He remained frozen, every instinct screaming to run, yet something deeper, something rooted in honor and compassion held him in place. As the thunder of hooves grew deafening and the night filled with warrior cries, Thomas Reddington stood beside the sleeping boys, breathing slow, steadying his voice, preparing to meet the most feared Apache leader alive, knowing that the next few minutes could determine whether he lived, died, or became forever entwined in the story of a people who guarded their own with unbreakable ferocity. And as the first rank of warriors emerged into the firelight, their faces painted, their weapons raised, and the massive figure of their father stepping forward on a horse as black as midnight, Thomas whispered to himself, "God help me, what have I done?" The massive warrior at the lead, the boy's father, sat tall atop his stallion, a towering presence with broad shoulders wrapped in a cloak of raven feathers, his hair braided with bone ornaments that clattered like warning chimes as the horse stamped the ground. And when his obsidian dark eyes locked onto Thomas, the air itself seemed to tighten as if the desert held its breath. Torches flickered behind him, illuminating row upon row of Apache fighters whose painted faces glowed like the masks of ancestral spirits. And Thomas could sense their fury radiating through the canyon like heat from a forge, a collective rage forged, not from hatred but from the fierce love they carried for their own. The chief dismounted with predatory grace, moving with the silent confidence of a man who had faced death and bent it to his will. And Thomas's throat tightened as the war leader approached, each step deliberate, echoing off the canyon walls with a weight that made the earth feel smaller. The chief stopped only a few feet away, staring at Thomas with an intensity that pierced through bone and stripped him of every illusion of safety. Behind the chief, warriors fanned into a semicircle, cutting off any movement or escape, while others scanned the camp with sharp, practiced eyes. The horses snorted, the wind carried the smell of sage and sweat, and Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding loud enough to drown out everything else. Yet he forced himself to stand still, hands lowered, palms visible, knowing one wrong motion could trigger a storm of arrows. When the chief finally spoke, his voice rolled like distant thunder, deep, raw, shaped by authority that few ever dared challenge. "Why do my sons sleep in your bed?" His English was rough but clear, and the accusation in it struck harder than any weapon. Thomas swallowed, stepping aside so the chief could see the boys more clearly, and he spoke slowly, choosing words as carefully as a man crossing thin ice, explaining how he had found them half dead, starving, and hunted, how he had given them water, food, and the only bedroll he had because they were children in need, not enemies. The chief's expression did not soften. In fact, the muscles in his jaw tightened as he looked at the boys, then back at Thomas, as if measuring the truth by the weight of silence. The older boy suddenly jerked awake, eyes wide with terror, and when he saw his father, he cried out weakly, trying to sit up before collapsing back down. His injuries too severe to allow the gesture. That alone shifted the air. Thomas saw it happen. The chief's gaze wavered, just for a heartbeat, with something fierce and protective, a father's instinct that even war could not extinguish. And he knelt beside his sons, touching their foreheads, checking their wounds with hands that trembled with barely contained emotion. When he turned back to Thomas, the canyon seemed to hold its breath again, and the chief asked only one question: who hurt them? Thomas answered honestly, describing the signs he had seen: bruises consistent with falls, deep cuts from sharp rocks, the exhaustion of long pursuit. And though he lacked full understanding, he shared what the boys had whispered: an enemy had chased them. The chief closed his eyes briefly, nodding once, confirming something Thomas could not yet comprehend. Then, without warning, he stood and raised his hand, signaling to his warriors, and several stepped forward toward Thomas, causing instinctual fear to surge through him. He took a step back, certain this was the moment they would seize him, bind him, or worse, but instead the chief spoke sharply in Apache, and the warriors stopped mid-motion, lowering their weapons. The chief addressed Thomas again, this time more quietly, a dangerous calm beneath the words. A man who gives his bed to another man's children is either a friend or a fool on the edge of death. Thomas forced a shaky breath, replying with as much courage as he could muster: perhaps I'm both. A few warriors exchanged surprised glances, and even the chief's lip twitched almost to smirk, but too grim to be humor. Then the chief commanded his men to fetch water, herbs, and blankets, and the warriors moved with disciplined speed. Some began tending to the boys' injuries, using salves and poultices Thomas recognized from his months studying Apache medicine, while others rebuilt the campfire, reinforcing its heat with dry wood. To Thomas's shock, the chief himself motioned for him to stay where he was, neither prisoner nor ally, but something in between, a stranger whose intentions puzzled him. As the night deepened, the war party formed a protective circle around the camp, creating a living fortress of batas, spears, and horses. And Thomas realized that despite their overwhelming numbers and intimidating presence, they had not harmed him. Instead, they watched him with curiosity, suspicion, and a growing sense of respect. When the chief finally sat across from Thomas, the fire casting shadows across his carved features, he asked the question that would determine the nature of everything to follow: why help my sons when you know we could kill you for touching them? Thomas took a moment before answering, his voice low, steady. Carrying the weight of his own past, he spoke of the war that had broken him, of the soldiers he could not save, of his vow to never again turn away from a wounded soul, no matter their tribe, color, or allegiance. He spoke of the desert, which had taught him that survival meant nothing if one lost the humanity needed to preserve it. The chief listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, until finally he leaned back, exhaling a long breath through his nose. My sons were hunted by men who wished to break our people, he said quietly, his tone shifting from wrath to sorrow. If they had died before I reached them, the plains would have burned. Thomas felt a chill ripple down his spine as he grasped the implication. The chief had brought 150 warriors, not for a search but for vengeance, and his arrival at Thomas's camp had spared more than just 2 young lives. It had prevented a warpath from igniting across the territory. As the fire crackled and the warriors settled into their positions, Thomas felt the chief's gaze on him again, not hostile now but appraising, as though deciding what kind of man stood before him. Then the chief spoke words Thomas would never forget. Tonight, you are under the protection of my people, not because you asked, but because my sons breathe because of you. With those words, the balance of the night shifted. Where death had loomed moments before, a fragile peace now settled like desert dust after a storm. Thomas sat back, exhausted, overwhelmed, yet strangely relieved, as the weight of tension finally eased from his shoulders. Above them, the moon climbed higher, illuminating the canyon and the countless warriors who had come ready for war, but now guarded the camp in silence. Thomas glanced at the sleeping boys, wrapped now in warm Apache blankets, and he could not help thinking how a simple act of compassion had brought him face to face with a legendary chief and altered the course of a night that might very well shape the future. He leaned against the canyon wall, exhaling, letting the crackle of the flames lull his frayed nerves until his eyes grew heavy. And as he drifted toward sleep, surrounded by the most feared warriors in the territory, he could not shake the sense that this was only the beginning. That dawn would bring truths, choices, and dangers far greater than the night had revealed, and that whatever path lay ahead, He had stepped into a story far larger than himself,